Hello and welcome back to Hacking COVID-19, a joint series from MedISAO, the Dime Society, and Biohacking Village. Today we have a special guest, Francis Cohen from Promenade Software, who's here to talk about how you design medical devices and what some of these hackerspaces and makerspaces can do when they're trying to design rapidly during this pandemic. So welcome, Francis.
Thank you, Dan. All right, I am Francis Cohen. I'm President and CEO of Promenade Software. And just a little bit of background on Promenade Software. We make software for medical devices. The device itself, the custom software that goes into it, the connectivity to mobile and cloud support. So my background is a lot of medical device software. I've been in the field for about, I hate to even say, probably about 25 years. And what I want to talk about today is giving people who don't have quite as much experience a little bit of background on what goes into making a medical device, especially as we have some need for very rapid development due to the COVID-19 situation. So, as we have seen at Promenade, we're getting a lot of requests for help with these devices. We have some more hobbyist engineers that say, hey, I can make a ventilator, to physician entrepreneurs that know the space, know the biochemistry that goes into it and want to make a device, to actually medical device firms that are used to it and know the procedures. So when we talk to the different people that are involved, we want to make sure that they understand what it takes to make a medical device. And that's what we'll cover here at a very high level. There's a lot of detail. If you're actually going to approach this, please hire a specialist if you're not already an expert on the field. So the first thing I like to make sure for our clients is that they prototype their technology. Make sure it works. Before you engage for production instruments, we can help you prototype, but it's kind of a rapid prototype, and we want to make sure that you actually have a technology that works, because otherwise you'll be spending money on a lot of documentation, a lot of development that you might have to change completely to change your technology. Your device will have to be clinically proven to be effective and safe before you even attempt to put it to market. And that's what the FDA regulatory is for. And it will have to go through regulatory in order to get to market. Even in a pandemic, the FDA needs to make sure that these devices actually work. So let's talk about the design control in making a medical device. If you start at the highest level, you really need to document and understand what your requirements are. These are your design inputs. What do you need out of this device? From the marketing perspective, from the product perspective, the engineers will do their lower level requirements to break it down for you. But it is very important to upfront have a really solid idea of what it is you're designing. It can change. It's kind of a cyclic approach, but get it on paper so that the other people can start working on it. The next step is, well, let's go back to step one. Having here the design outputs. At the high level, at least understand your overall system design, what it is you're looking at, the high level. Then you can do a hazard analysis. The hazard analysis is probably one of the most critical steps when designing a medical device. The reason is that this is a safety critical device. You can actually do harm. So you need to prevent that. You need to understand what kind of harm you can cause and then figure out how to mitigate it with controls. So if you designed out your basic architecture, you know what your requirements are. Next step is to figure out how this instrument, if things go wrong, could harm somebody, and what backups you will have to mitigate it. Then step 3 is to put those mitigating controls back into your requirements for your engineers. Now, obviously, this is a joint effort to figure out the requirements and the mitigations. It's an engineering process, but it requires everybody involved, from the stakeholders to the people that understand the technology, whether it's a chemist or the system designers, to the engineers, the electrical, mechanical, software. Everybody needs to take part in this and think about how they are going to mitigate the hazards that this could cause. And we're going to get into this a little bit more because it's a super important part of the design control. So again, there is a tendency, especially when we see it amongst our clients, to get a little bit excited about what works. And it's easy, we get excited about it too. We're happy to get involved in these projects, to see this new technology that could, affect lives. But what we'll do is also to think about what could happen if they fail. What are the possibilities of harm? What could happen, whether it's harm to the patient or the user or the environment? All these need to be considered in the case that everything doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So to recap, we do a risk analysis for harm done to the patient, user, or the environment. Remember, when you're making a medical device, it probably can cause harm, and you need to be able to address it and mitigate for serious harm. There's a tendency we get in our clients to get very excited about what works and not really think about what could happen if it doesn't work, what may fail. And we'll often help the client through that process because it's an important step in the development to consider the risks. Let's take some examples. Let's say a ventilator, you're making a ventilator. What could go wrong in your design that could cause harm if you ended up with the wrong mix of oxygen, for instance, or too little or too much pressure, or the system hung at the wrong time and you didn't get the cycle of pressure and no pressure? What would that cause? Obviously, in a ventilator, that could cause serious injury or death. So what are you going to do to mitigate it? If a sensor goes bad, for instance, you should maybe have your software detect that the sensor is not responding and set off an alarm, for instance. Those are the types of things to think about. If you're doing a COVID-19 test, what would happen if you had false positives, false negatives? What could cause them? Could you get contamination between samples? What will you do to prevent that to actually end up with patient harm? Excuse me. And ask all the hard questions at each step. If you're doing a test, for instance, how will the test chemistry perform if this is a home test under more extreme conditions? Maybe it got shipped and it was very warm in storage. Will the chemistry survive that? Will the test still work? You have to make sure that it will for home testing. If it's used in a lab, you have a lot more of a controlled environment, and you have trained personnel that are used to that sort of thing. So it's a little bit easier. So you need to know your users, your environment it's going to be used in, and what you can do to prevent it, or at least know it's a failure so that when it's used, it says failure instead of a false positive or false negative. You always want to keep an audit trail. You need to, for instance, keep track of the lot information of chemistry used. Perhaps there's a bad lot and you need to be able to track it down. These are sort of the basics in keeping track of what's going on with these devices when they're out in the field. So let's look at what a hazard analysis entails. When you're doing a hazard analysis, it's actually kind of a formal process of doing it. It helps guide whoever is doing it to do it more objectively and come out with more standardized results. You might start with the severity of harm that could be caused. You'll rate it, and there's a numerical rating from 1 to 5. That's our example. It doesn't have to be exactly this, but the idea here is to enumerate it and make something that is not quite so subjective. So we have, for instance, we rate our severity from insignificant to catastrophic, you can see, and that's 1 to 5. We say the probability of occurrence. So, for instance, if something is very improbable, for instance, a sensor going bad, you might consider to be an improbable event. What is the probability from incredible, very, very low, to quite frequent? Those are the things you might want to consider. And then lastly, the detectability. If you can actually tell that there's a problem, then you can set off alarms, you can have a test result that says test failed, for instance. So that's a good thing. If it's detectable, it's positive. If it's not, then you might get this false negative, false positive, or just not know that a ventilator, for instance, has ceased to function. You take these numbers and you multiply them out. Again, this is based off of some standards. 14971 is an ISO standard that people are required to use in the medical device space. And you can tell by the chart in the slide that you have the green, yellow, and red. Green is obviously you're clear to go, it's acceptable. Yellow, you probably should address, might be acceptable. And of course, red, where this could actually cause death or serious injury and needs to be addressed. Taking those numbers, you fill out a spreadsheet. We'll be providing this spreadsheet to you. At the end of the slide, there'll be a link. Basically, in the spreadsheet, you're going to look at the harm that can be caused, the situation that causes the harm, those numbers that we provided just earlier, and then the mitigating control, and the verification activities. After you've done the controls, you consider, okay, what is the new severity, the new probability, and new detectability? The end result, the multiplication, is your mitigated risk, and hopefully those go all green, maybe reds will go to yellow, and they're acceptable. Bottom line is to design your device around safety and reliability. What are some of the high-level engineering decisions you can make to make it safe, for instance? I'll give an example in software. When we're looking at controls, say of a pressure meter, we need to be in real time. We can't have the operating system go off and do something else, as a commercial operating system might, while we're tightly regulating something like pressure. So in that case, we'll use a real-time operating system. We'll often separate out the modules, if you were, from the operating system level. So you have a module that is doing the real-time control, and a part that is a module that's doing more of the connectivity, the user interface, the things that are not quite as risk involved. So that's the type of decision we'll make when we are considering the device safety. A big part of making a medical device is the usability. The human factors are very important to make sure the device is safe and effective. So know your audience. Who is using the device, and will they know how to use it in the conditions that they're working? So for instance, if you're making a ventilator, you've got trained staff at the hospital, great, but they might be exhausted. Your ventilator, if it's different from all the other ones, they might not remember their training or know how to use it, or they could make mistakes. So you want to use conventions that people are used to in the medical arena and make it simple. Make it as idiot-proof as you can, because people using it are coming from all different levels of, like I said, they could be exhausted, they could be trained, but they're also trained on 1,000 other devices, so they don't remember. So you need to make it as idiot-proof as possible. Home health devices, if this is, say, a home test, you're sending it out to people to test themselves at home. Again, you have all different levels of education, expertise, and ability to follow directions. So it needs to be easy. And usability is a big part of what the FDA will be looking at as well, because they're aware, acutely aware, of how devices that are hard to use can cause errors and possibly harm. What are the important steps of your design controls is what we call V&V in the industry. V&V is verification and validation. Verification is the step of proving that all your requirements are met. It's an engineering task. We have requirements, then we test to the requirements. Every piece has to be tested, and we have to trace against each other. So we can trace that we tested against the requirements, and we provide proof of that. Validation, that's the test that proves this is effective for patients. We've had clients, again, when they're coming in a little bit less experienced, sort of forget that indeed you need to fully validate that this works and provide evidence to the FDA that indeed the product is effective for patients. So for instance, if you're doing a COVID-19 test, you have to have some clinical evidence that it is effective and it works. The engineers can go off and design to your requirements. They can do a perfect job of it. The engineering does exactly what you said in your requirements, but it could be that your test doesn't work, or somehow your ventilator doesn't work because you're using a new technology, perhaps, and it needs to work is the bottom line. So just want to emphasize that, because these are two important pieces, verification and validation of the device. When you go to the FDA, the regulatory, you will need to submit your entire design history file, documentation that's part of that. If you don't have experience with that, it is crucial you get help from the experts, because there's a lot that goes into it. A lot of pieces, a lot of small pieces that need to be covered. Often a lot of those are not difficult. I think I've covered the big pieces, the requirements, the design, the risk analysis, and the verification. But there's a lot of small pieces that need to happen as well. If you're using off-the-shelf software, can that cause a problem? That should go into your risk analysis. But a person that's more aware of these type of things that they'll be looking for at the FDA can help you beef up your submission to cover that. And also importantly is to put yourself in the shoes of the auditor. Their job is to make sure they're keeping the public safe and that only effective products reach the market. You can be very excited about your technology, about your the capability of your product. But if you can't prove it, the auditor's going to send you back because their job is to make sure it's proven. So even though it sounds great and it has great potential, you need to prove it. And that's it. If you have any more questions, please reach out to us. I provided some links. You can always reach us at info@promenadesoftware.com, and we will provide the risk analysis spreadsheet for you. That's such an important part of making a device. We want to make sure that everybody has that and can think in the way that the auditors will think as far as your risk analysis. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Daniel, and please ask any questions.
All right, thank you, Francis. We'll include a description. In the description, if you look below, there should be a link, so you can just click that instead of having to type it in. And I really want to encourage anyone watching this right now to see our previous video series. It's a 3-part series from Dr. Jeff Tully, who's an anesthesiologist in Sacramento, and he talks about what he as a physician wants in any of these rapidly developed ventilators, what the requirements from his point of view would be, even for the most basic kind of ventilator. If that's really informative, if you're thinking about getting involved in building one of these things, to see what do the doctors need, what do the clinicians need, and making sure that you're building the appropriate thing for them. A couple of questions, Francis. So I see that you hear about Tesla and Ford and all these automotive companies are getting into maybe creating these ventilators very rapidly. And then they've never built a medical device before, but they do come from a regulated space. Do you think they'll have success in this?
Yes, there's a lot of parallels in any regulated space because they're dealing with safety, and the requirements of the engineering are pretty much the same. They might have slightly different guidelines, but the end result of the design history file is pretty much the same. So I think a company like Ford and Tesla can absolutely make a ventilator, as long as, of course, they have somebody on board that understands ventilator space, understands the requirements for a ventilator, understands what they need to do, and how users expect to use them. But from an engineering perspective, absolutely.
Do you think the FDA, I mean, has the FDA relaxed any of their requirements when it comes to submitting this kind of documentation that you know of?
The FDA has changed the requirements only for existing devices. If you need to make a change on an existing design that's already been cleared, you need to make the change maybe because your supply chain is impacted and you're putting in different tubing or something. They will let that go without new submission material for COVID. However, for new devices, they really want to make sure that nothing gets to market that's not proven effective and proven safe. That's their job. So relaxing on the submission, they might fast track it if you have that proof. They might not look at some of the details that in perhaps cybersecurity or other things that they'll often look very closely at, but it needs to work. And that's their job, is to protect and make sure it's safe and effective.
Okay, this has been very informative. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge here. And thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.